Amid the jungles of Southeast Asia, far from the headlines of Europe, a brutal and often forgotten campaign unfolded. Between 1942 and 1945, British and Commonwealth soldiers fought one of the most grueling battles of the Second World War, against the Imperial Japanese Army in Burma. It was a war of exhaustion, fought not only against a determined enemy, but also against the jungle itself, where disease, monsoon rains, and starvation claimed more lives than bullets. For Britain, Burma was never meant to be a main theater of war. Yet, for thousands of soldiers from Britain, India, Africa, and across the Commonwealth, it became a crucible of endurance, courage, and neglect. The story begins in December 1941. Japan's entry into the war with the attack on Pearl Harbor was swiftly followed by simultaneous invasions across Southeast Asia. British possessions, Hong Kong, Malaya, and Burma were suddenly on the front line. For Japan, Burma offered a vital prize: control of the land route to China. Capturing it would cut off supplies to Chiang Kai-shek's Chinese forces while securing Japan's western flank against any British counterattack from India. By early 1942, the British colonial forces in Burma were ill-prepared. The country's defense rested on the so-called Burma Army, an uneasy mix of British regulars, Indian divisions, and locally raised Burmese units. Many of them were poorly trained, ill-equipped, and unfamiliar with jungle warfare. Facing them was one of Japan's most experienced forces, the 15th Army, commanded by General Shojiro Ida. Veterans of the Malayan and Chinese campaigns, Japanese troops were disciplined, well adapted to tropical conditions, and fiercely motivated by the momentum of their early victories. The Japanese advance into Burma was swift and devastating. Rangoon, the capital and Britain's main port in the region, fell in March 1942. The retreat that followed became one of the longest and most chaotic in British military history. Columns of soldiers, nurses, and refugees fled northwards through the choking jungle, many dying along the way. Among them were British regulars from the 17th Indian Division, units of the Royal Berkshire Regiment, and thousands of Indian troops who had served under colonial command. They withdrew through torrential rain, crossing rivers by makeshift rafts, abandoning vehicles and artillery in the mud. Dysentery, malaria, and exhaustion took a toll almost equal to enemy fire. By May, the remnants of the British and Indian forces had retreated into India, shattered and demoralized. The Japanese now stood on the borders of British India, an unprecedented threat to Britain's most prized colony. For London, the loss of Burma was not just a military disaster, but a symbolic one. It exposed the weakness of imperial power in Asia and emboldened nationalist movements both within India and in the wider empire. In the following months, the Allied command in India, under General Archibald Wavell, faced a staggering challenge. The Burma front had to be rebuilt from nothing. Roads were impassable, supply lines overstretched, and morale dangerously low. Yet, slowly, a new army was taking shape. It would include not only British regulars, but also hundreds of thousands of Indian soldiers, African troops from East and West Africa, and locally recruited Burmese levies. Reinforcements from Britain arrived reluctantly and in small numbers, a sign of how far the Far East had slipped down Churchill's list of priorities. Europe and North Africa remained the focus of Britain's strategic effort. Burma was seen as a sideshow, fought largely by colonial manpower under British officers. Still, to the men who fought there, it was anything but secondary. The campaign became a bitter test of endurance and ingenuity. Men learned to fight in impossible terrain, choking humidity, leech-infested swamps, and endless rain. Aircraft had to drop supplies to remote jungle clearings, and new tactics were devised for survival and combat. From the Chindits, the long-range penetration groups under Ord Wingate, to the ordinary infantrymen holding a rain-soaked trench, each played their part in a campaign that would eventually reclaim Burma from Japanese control. But victory would not come quickly. Between 1942 and 1945, the Burma Campaign dragged on with a ferocity often overshadowed by events in Europe and the Pacific. For the British soldiers who served there, the experience was isolating, both physically and historically. Many would later call it the Forgotten War. This is their story: the endurance, the failure, and the eventual resurgence of British arms in one of the harshest battlefields of the Second World War. The campaign in Burma forced the British Army to rethink nearly every assumption about how war was fought. Traditional European-style tactics, based on open terrain, mechanized movement, and fixed supply lines, proved useless in the Burmese jungle. The landscape dictated everything. Thick bamboo, torrential rain, and oppressive humidity rendered vehicles and heavy artillery almost worthless. Small units, operating on foot and supplied from the air, became the core of jungle warfare. The British learned slowly and painfully. In 1942, Japanese light infantry tactics, emphasizing infiltration, surprise, and close combat, devastated Allied units that were still tied to road networks and rigid formations. Japanese soldiers could move silently through dense terrain, bypassing defenses and cutting supply lines before their presence was even known. The British initially mistook these attacks for isolated incidents, until entire brigades were found surrounded and destroyed in what became known as the jungle trap. To counter this, new methods emerged. The British began training specialized jungle units, emphasizing stealth, movement, and independence. One of the key innovations was the reliance on air supply. By 1943, the Royal Air Force and American transport squadrons had developed the capacity to sustain entire divisions by air, dropping ammunition, rations, and even mules into clearings marked by smoke or colored panels. The Chindits, operating deep behind Japanese lines, were the earliest test case for this method. Their operations proved both the potential and the peril of long-range jungle warfare. Successes came at enormous human cost, but they demonstrated that even in the most hostile terrain, Allied forces could sustain offensive action. The British also began adapting their weapons and equipment. Lighter small arms, collapsible boats, mosquito nets, and improved field rations were introduced. Lessons from these improvisations would later influence post-war doctrines in Malaya and Borneo. The Burma Campaign became a laboratory for tactical innovation, born not from theory, but from necessity. For the men on the ground, Burma was a war of isolation and endurance. Soldiers often went weeks without seeing the enemy or any sign of civilization. The heat was oppressive. Clothing rotted, boots disintegrated, and bodies were eaten by leeches and mosquitoes. Malaria, dysentery, and jungle ulcers were constant companions. The greatest enemy was often exhaustion. British soldiers, many drawn from regiments used to Europe's temperate climates, found themselves in an alien world. The jungle created a psychological claustrophobia. Visibility rarely extended beyond a few yards, and every rustle in the undergrowth might conceal an ambush. Many veterans later said they never felt safe, even when supposedly behind friendly lines. Sleep deprivation and constant vigilance took their toll. Medical officers described cases of jungle madness, a condition born of isolation, fear, and fatigue. Yet amidst these hardships, bonds of solidarity formed that transcended class and nationality. British regulars fought alongside Indian sepoys, Gurkhas from Nepal, and African troops from Nigeria, Kenya, and the Gold Coast. Communication often depended more on instinct than language. Shared suffering blurred the distinctions of empire. And in that hardship, many men glimpsed a kind of equality rare in the colonial world. Those who survived Burma often spoke of it as the hardest experience of their lives. Many felt forgotten, overshadowed by the glamour of the war in Europe or the Pacific. Their victories were slow, invisible, and won in silence. But their endurance, through disease, hunger, and fear, became the quiet backbone of Britain's fight in Asia. At the command level, the Burma Campaign was shaped by a complex mix of rivalry, innovation, and reform. Early failures in 1942 exposed deep flaws in British leadership. Command structures were rigid, intelligence poor, and coordination between British, Indian, American, and Chinese forces chaotic. The retreat from Burma was marked by confusion and blame. General Archibald Wavell, then Commander-in-Chief in India, faced impossible logistical challenges but also suffered from indecision and lack of support from London. In 1943, Churchill replaced Wavell with General Claude Auchinleck and then, crucially, appointed General William Slim to lead the newly formed 14th Army. Slim would prove one of Britain's most effective and underrated commanders of the war. A veteran of Gallipoli and Mesopotamia, Slim understood both the tactical and human dimensions of warfare. He recognized that morale, training, and adaptation mattered as much as firepower. Under Slim's leadership, the British and Indian armies in Burma were transformed. He reorganized logistics, emphasized jungle training, and insisted that every soldier, regardless of rank, learn to live, move, and fight in the jungle. He redefined the campaign's psychology. It was not a hopeless sideshow, but a battle for redemption after 1942's humiliation. His 14th Army, a vast and multinational force, became known as the Forgotten Army, a name that Slim embraced with pride. Slim's command philosophy was pragmatic and inclusive. He valued the contributions of Indian and African soldiers and worked to improve conditions and medical support. When the Japanese launched their invasion of India in 1944, Slim's leadership would prove decisive, not through grand strategy, but through trust in his men and mastery of logistics. The Burma Campaign carried consequences that reached far beyond the battlefield. For Britain, it tested the moral fabric of empire at its breaking point. The war in Burma relied heavily on colonial manpower, Indian, Burmese, African, yet these same soldiers were fighting to uphold an empire that was already crumbling. Many Indian troops returned home with new expectations, and the war's end accelerated the demand for independence. Strategically, the campaign tied together multiple threads of the global conflict. The recapture of Burma restored the overland route to China, the Lido Road, vital for keeping China in the war. It also secured India's eastern frontier and denied Japan access to Bengal and Assam, where an invasion could have sparked political chaos. Yet even in victory, the human cost was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of civilians died from famine, displacement, and forced labor. The collapse of Burma's colonial administration left a vacuum that would later erupt into civil conflict. Morally, the campaign revealed both the endurance and the contradictions of Britain's war in Asia. It was fought in the name of freedom, yet sustained by empire. The soldiers on the ground rarely saw this contradiction. For them, survival was purpose enough. But in hindsight, Burma marked the twilight of British imperial confidence. It was the last great colonial war, one fought not for expansion, but for the preservation of a vanishing order. The turning point of the Burma Campaign came in 1944, when the Japanese, seeking to finish what they had begun 2 years earlier, launched an ambitious invasion of India. It was a bold gamble, intended to destroy the British 14th Army and ignite rebellion within India itself. For Japan's commanders, it was the moment to strike a decisive blow before Allied strength in Asia became overwhelming. For Britain, it was the test that would determine whether the long years of retreat and rebuilding had been worth it. By early 1944, the Imperial Japanese Army's 15th Army, under General Renya Mutaguchi, prepared to cross the Chindwin River into British-held territory. Their target was Imphal, a vital logistics and communications hub in northeast India, defended by the British IV Corps. Once Imphal fell, Mutaguchi intended to seize Kohima, cutting the road to Dimapur, the main British supply base in Assam. The Japanese believed that if they could destroy the British Indian Army in the field, India might erupt in revolt, forcing Britain out of Asia entirely. Mutaguchi's plan was daring, but fatally optimistic. His forces, the 31st, 33rd, and 15th Divisions, were ordered to march hundreds of miles through mountainous jungle, carrying limited supplies and relying on captured British stockpiles for sustenance. The British, however, had changed since 1942. Under General William Slim, the 14th Army had been reorganized, retrained, and prepared for exactly such an attack. Slim anticipated the Japanese offensive and planned to fight it not through retreat, but by holding his ground and turning the enemy's isolation against them. In March 1944, the Japanese assault began. Columns of infantry crossed the Chindwin, their advance concealed by the dense jungle. They struck the British outposts along the Tidham-Imphal road, cutting supply routes and forcing several garrisons into defensive positions. Imphal, surrounded on three sides, became the focal point of the campaign. Simultaneously, the Japanese 31st Division advanced toward Kohima, where a small British garrison, later reinforced by Indian and British troops, would soon face one of the fiercest sieges of the entire war. The fighting around Imphal and Kohima was savage and unrelenting. Japanese troops, hardened by years of combat, launched repeated assaults against entrenched British and Indian positions. At Kohima, the battle was fought at such close quarters that soldiers on opposing sides hurled grenades across a tennis court that separated their lines, a now iconic image of the campaign. Supply drops by the Royal Air Force became the lifeline for the defenders, as all land routes were cut off. Slim's insistence on air logistics proved decisive. Where once the British had starved in the jungle, now it was the Japanese who suffered from hunger and disease. For the first time in the Burma War, the tactical and moral balance began to shift. British and Indian units held firm under siege, their discipline and air support gradually breaking the momentum of the Japanese advance. By May, the tide was turning. At Imphal, British counterattacks began to drive the encircling forces back, while at Kohima, after weeks of ferocious fighting, the Japanese were forced to retreat from the ridge they had held. By late May 1944, the Japanese invasion of India had stalled. What had begun as a bold strike to destroy the British 14th Army had become a catastrophe of attrition. General Slim's defensive plan, to hold key positions, rely on air supply, and let the Japanese outrun their logistics, was working exactly as intended. The same terrain that had once doomed British armies now trapped the Japanese in a slow and starving retreat. At Imphal, British and Indian divisions, supported by constant aerial resupply, began counterattacks that turned the encirclement into a rout. The Japanese, who had advanced deep into India with only limited rations, now found themselves cut off from food, ammunition, and medical supplies. The promised capture of British depots never came. RAF Dakotas and U.S. transport planes dominated the skies, dropping supplies to Allied units and strafing Japanese columns along mountain roads. The once invincible 15th Army was dying in the jungle it had sought to conquer. At Kohima, the siege was finally broken in mid-May. The relief force, fighting its way along the Dimapur road, reached the battered defenders who had held out for weeks under almost continuous bombardment. The sight of the ruined tennis court, littered with spent shells and broken helmets, symbolized the turning point of the entire Burma War. For the first time, the Japanese army had been decisively defeated in a major land battle. As the monsoon rains arrived, the Japanese withdrawal became a collapse. Units disintegrated under disease, starvation, and exhaustion. Some divisions lost more than half their men without ever engaging in another major action. Slim's pursuit was relentless but measured. His goal was not vengeance, but annihilation of Japan's capacity to fight in Burma. By July, the survivors of Mutaguchi's force had retreated across the Chindwin, leaving behind thousands of dead. The twin battles of Imphal and Kohima marked a profound shift in the war's momentum. They shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility on land. Slim's 14th Army, once derided as the Forgotten Army, had achieved one of Britain's greatest victories of the Second World War. The scale of the Japanese defeat was immense. Over 50,000 casualties, compared to roughly 17,000 Allied. Disease accounted for many deaths, but it was strategy and endurance that had broken the Japanese. Imphal and Kohima did more than secure India. They opened the way for the reconquest of Burma. From this point onward, Slim's forces, British, Indian, African, and Gurkha, would advance southward, reclaiming territory inch by inch through jungle and monsoon toward Mandalay and Rangoon. What began as a defensive victory became the foundation of a relentless offensive. By the end of 1944, the 14th Army was advancing into central Burma. The Japanese, now overstretched and undersupplied, fought stubbornly but without hope of reversal. The Allies had mastered the terrain, perfected the art of jungle supply, and forged an army capable of operating independently from fixed bases. A transformation born from the humiliations of 1942. When Rangoon fell in May 1945, it was the culmination of 3 years of hardship and adaptation. The men who fought there, many of them British soldiers long forgotten by history, had turned a campaign of despair into one of redemption. The fall of Rangoon in May 1945 brought the Burma Campaign to its long and bitter end. For the men of the British 14th Army, it was a victory that had been earned the hard way, through years of defeat, adaptation, and endurance in some of the world's harshest terrain. Yet, it was also a victory that passed almost unnoticed in Britain itself. Europe was celebrating the surrender of Germany. In the public mind, the war in Asia seemed distant, secondary. The soldiers who had fought and bled in Burma returned, home to find their campaign already fading from national memory. Militarily, the reconquest of Burma was a remarkable achievement. Slim's army, numbering more than 1 million men at its peak, had executed one of the most complex and sustained operations of the entire war. Air supply had made the impossible possible. Whole divisions sustained by transport aircraft across hundreds of miles of jungle. Allied engineers had built airstrips, bridges, and roads under fire, while medical units fought malaria and dysentery with increasing success. The army that retook Burma was a symbol of logistical mastery, proof that, given time and leadership, Britain and its allies could adapt to any theater of war. But the cost was immense. Between 1942 and 1945, the Allied forces in Burma suffered more than 200,000 casualties. Tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers died, many not from battle but from starvation and disease. Civilian losses were even higher. Burmese villages were destroyed, crops burned, and populations displaced by both sides. The devastation of the countryside was total. Famine and forced labor became as deadly as the fighting itself. When British forces re-entered Rangoon, they found a city hollowed by occupation and hardship. Politically, victory in Burma came too late to preserve Britain's imperial authority. The war had changed Asia irrevocably. Indian soldiers, who made up the majority of Slim's army, had proven their courage and professionalism, not as colonial subjects, but as equals on the battlefield. Many returned home with new perspectives, their loyalty to Britain tempered by awareness of their own strength. Within 2 years, India would gain independence, and the empire whose defense had justified the Burma Campaign would begin to dissolve. In Burma itself, the end of the Japanese occupation did not bring peace. The nationalist forces that had once fought alongside the Japanese, notably Aung San's Burma National Army, turned against their former allies and negotiated independence from Britain. Civil conflict followed, as ethnic and political factions vied for control of the new nation. The war had fractured Burma's society and destroyed its infrastructure, leaving wounds that would take generations to heal. For Britain, the campaign's legacy was paradoxical. It was one of the finest feats of arms in its military history, yet one of the least remembered. The men who had fought under Slim, British, Indian, African, Gurkha, often felt that their struggle had been overshadowed by the triumphs in Europe. They had fought a war of mud, heat, and silence, far from the cameras and parades. Many returned home quietly, carrying with them memories of jungle nights, torrential rain, and comrades lost to unseen enemies. Yet for those who understood its meaning, Burma stood as proof of something vital, that even after humiliation and near collapse, discipline, leadership, and endurance could restore an army's honor. The forgotten war had not been fought in vain. It had defended India, secured Southeast Asia, and broken the myth of Japanese invincibility. The Burma Campaign remains one of the most extraordinary and least celebrated chapters of Britain's Second World War. It was a war that tested every limit of endurance, physical, moral, and strategic. In Europe, the British Army had fought amid towns and fields, supported by powerful allies and constant supply. In Burma, it fought in isolation, through jungle and monsoon, against an enemy that knew the terrain and seemed unstoppable. Yet, it was here, on the far edges of empire, that the British and Commonwealth forces rediscovered their strength. What made the Burma Campaign remarkable was not only the scale of its victory, but the nature of its transformation. The soldiers, who had retreated in 1942, broken, diseased, and demoralized, were the same army that triumphed in 1945. Their success was not born of technological superiority or overwhelming numbers, but of patience, adaptation, and leadership. Slim's 14th Army became a symbol of quiet professionalism, a force that learned to survive where others perished, to fight where no army was meant to move. And yet, history seldom spoke their names. The attention of the world shifted to Europe, then to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The jungles of Burma faded from memory, their battles remembered mainly by those who fought them. To many veterans, the sense of being forgotten lingered long after the war ended. Their story was overshadowed not because it lacked heroism, but because it lacked spectacle. No grand invasions, no liberation of capitals, just the slow grind of endurance in silence and rain. In the years that followed, historians would come to see Burma as more than a sideshow. It was a campaign that reshaped military thought on logistics, joint operations, and psychological resilience. It also marked the twilight of empire, a moment when soldiers from across the Commonwealth fought together for a world that would soon vanish. In that sense, the Burma Campaign was both an ending and a beginning, the last great imperial war, and the first glimpse of a post-imperial world. The British soldiers who fought there, on ridgelines like Kohima, in river crossings near Mandalay, in the sodden trenches outside Imphal, earned a quiet place in history. They did not fight for glory or recognition, but for survival, for duty, and for one another. And though their struggle was long forgotten by many, its lessons remain enduring. That courage need not be loud, and that even in the darkest corners of war, dignity and determination can prevail.